So first item, page 1, dependency council caseload ratios. Again, we had a very full discussion on this. The importance of making sure that those in our foster care system have appropriate representation. Assemblywoman Weber.
Yeah, move the assembly version.
Okay, the motion is to approve the $33 million general fund to reduce the caseloads for dependency council.
3-0.
There's no trailblazer language, just the funding. 3-0, 3-0.
It's 7.8 million for Senate, yeah.
Since we have a full house again, we're just going to go back very briefly to pick up those 3 votes. In transportation, the first one is page 2. There was 3-0 on the assembly side. Senator Nielsen on page 2 of transportation, 3-0. That closes that out. Page 5, we needed a vote on the Senate side. It was 3-0 on the assembly, 3-0 on the Senate. And then the last item in transportation, so we can leave it behind us, is page 8. We had 3-0 on the assembly side, 3-0 for the compromise on the Senate side. Page 8, we have completed transportation. Moving back to our second item in public safety, we have page 2. Which deals with additional trial court judges. And there is a compromise here. Would you like to share this with us, please?
Great. Anita Lee with the LAO. The compromise before you is $7.8 million for up to 12 new judgeships. Of this amount, $3 million would be available for judicial compensation. The remaining $4.8 million would be available for the corresponding staff and court interpreters. The funding identified here would be available after Judicial Council submits a funding request to the Department of Finance. And the funding request would propose an allocation of judgeships that is based on the judicial workload needs assessment, and only judgeships for courts reopening courtrooms closed after the 2011 trial court security realignment would be included. With that, there would not be an increased need for court security costs beyond the level already funded through the 2011 realignment.
Right. Thank you, Ms. Lee. So that is our compromise.
Move the compromise.
We have a motion for the compromise on page 2. 3-0.
Melendez has a question.
I just have a quick question,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman. So I'm satisfied with the compromise. However, we initially had the list of 12 counties that would be receiving these new judges. I want to be certain that that has not changed. So does that list remain the same?
The list potentially may change, which is one of the reasons why Judicial Council would be responsible for submitting a funding request to the Department of Finance. That would go through the typical review process through JLBC, et cetera. So the courts could change, it's possible, with the additional parameters related to trial court security.
Okay, are you suggesting that the list of counties, the judgeships would change based on funds or some other reason? Because it was my understanding that the list that we have was based on the greatest need. And I want to make sure that that doesn't change, that there isn't some other sort of, arbitrary.
So before it was just based on need. Under the compromise, there are 2 components. The first is that it's based on need, but then the second component is that it's going to courts who had courtrooms that closed after 2011 to negate the need for additional funds for trial court security costs. So there is an additional parameter.
Right.
So instead of just need, which it was before, now it's need plus that there was a closure of a courthouse as of 2011.
Okay, thank you.
I would just note that we're not supportive of the compromise, and we think that this approach to funding judgeships takes several significant departures away from existing statute that has been in place for many years about how we do fund judgeships when they are established. And I would just note that there were 50 additional judges that have never been funded that were approved in 2007. So I don't know that these additional 12 are needed at this time,
But those 50 were never funded, is that correct?
So in 2006, you had 50 that were approved and funded. Then in 2007, you had 50 that were approved but not funded.
That's correct.
Yes.
Right. So we're not creating new judgeships, we're funding those that had been created but not yet funded. Senator Nielsen.
I'd like to know what the rationale for that second criteria, courts that have been closed post-realignment, AB 109. What's the purpose of that additional criteria?
Sure. So as part of realignment, funds were shifted to the counties. And so if courtrooms were closed after 2011, the savings would go to the county. It would go to the county or the county sheriffs. And so I think the idea is by adding that parameter and providing a judgeship for that area, additional trial court security funds would not be needed to be provided by the state because those funds were already incurred as savings when those courtrooms were closed.
But would it not be looked at by the local sheriff as impacting their funds in some way?
So I think the idea related to additional funding relates to an increased level of service. And I think that this parameter was put into place essentially to say, you know, as of 2011, when the courtrooms or the courthouses closed, the savings did not incur to the state where it normally would have. The savings incurred to the county, essentially to the sheriffs. And so by reopening this courtroom, you're not increasing the level of service beyond what was in existence in 2011.
I do understand that, but I still intuit that this is a negative impact. And realignment was bad enough, and the sheriffs are having a lot of problems now with the courthouse security. I feel so strongly about it, I'm just going to vote no.
I would just note that we just received this compromise right before the hearing, and we are continuing to look at it in terms of its interactions with Proposition 30. As you all know, that trial court security costs were realigned as part of Proposition 30, and if the state takes an action that increases the overall costs of any one county, there is an obligation by the state to fund that obligation. So we just need to keep reviewing it. I'm not certain about how this interacts exactly, but.
Thank you. You take your time with that, and we believe that's the reason for the language. Ms. Lee, thank you for your explanation. We have 2-0 on the Senate side.
I'm going to have to abstain.
Okay, we understand. 2-0 on the Assembly side. Page 3 is also a compromise. This deals with the incompetent to stand trial waiting list that we talked about the other day. Mr. Soderberg.
Drew Soderberg, Legislative Analyst's Office. So the compromise before you would provide $6.1 million general fund above the amount proposed by the governor for an expansion of the Restoration of Competency Program. In addition, it would provide $8.7 million to activate a 50-bed IST unit at DSH Coalinga, and it would include trailer bill language intended to streamline the expansion of the Restoration of Competency Program.
Thank you, Mr. Soderberg.
Move the compromise.
All right, we do have a motion for the compromise. On the Senate side on page 3, 3-0
3-0.
and 3-0.
And we just continue to be concerned about the level of beds being supported in the state hospitals, and would continue to support the additional beds at the Atascadero State Hospital as necessary to meet the needs of the backlog incompetent to stand trial inmates that are sitting in county jails.
Thank you, Ms. Bosler. We think that the trailer bill language will streamline the Restoration of Competency Program with the counties, will be effective, and in effect will deal with the waiting list. Page 5 in the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation
Mr. Chair,
deals
move
with
the,
population estimates.
apologize. I move the assembly version.
All right, the Assembly version, which saves $10 million of general fund.
Rio.
Ms. Bosler?
Yes, we just continue to be concerned with the Assembly version. The May revision included a very aggressive reduction proposal to reduce the out-of-state contract beds and 120 million general fund savings below the January budget proposal. So we are concerned about an additional $10 million reduction to CDCR's budget in the budget year.
Thank you. So the Assembly version is based on the Legislative Analyst Office population projections, so I imagine Mr. Soderberg will stand by those. The vote on the Senate side is 3-0.
3-0.
3-0. Page 6 is the California Rehabilitation Center closure. We again had a very hearty conversation on this the other day.
We don't need additional language on this, or just the same?
Assemblywoman?
We moved the Senate version that has some trailer bill language to it, I believe. We moved the Senate version.
All right. So the trailer bill language reinstates the state's commitment to closing the rehabilitation center, and this is in Norco, within 6 months of the activation of the 3 infill facilities. Again, this should sound familiar because we probably spent about a half hour on it the other day. Ms. Bosler?
Yes, we do not support the trailer bill language at this time. We are committing to doing a new blueprint this fall that we will bring to you in our January budget, evaluating comprehensively the needs of the state in terms of its overall prison capacity, but we are not comfortable hardwiring in the closure of the California Rehabilitation Center at this time.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, I find myself yet again agreeing with the governor. No.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, I know a motion has been made. I wonder if there's any desire at all to hold this open just a little longer?
Today,
In number of minutes or hours?
Well, hours, geez, I don't know. I was thinking just another 30 minutes or so.
If you would like, of course.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So page 6 will be held open.
You got a member concern down there, I think.
Moving to page 7, which is our C-post composition. Again, we had a full conversation with regard to the makeup of the Commission on Correctional Peace Officer Standards and Training. So there was mention of a possible compromise of a compromise. The Senate version was to add a 7th member at the suggestion of the LAO. That 7th member would be a nationally recognized expert on correctional officer training appointed by the legislature. The suggested compromise here would be that we go with the 7th member, as recommended, a national expert, but rather than have that member chosen by the legislature, have that person chosen by the governor with Senate confirmation.
We do not support the compromise. There was significant work that went into the agreement on the reestablishment of the Correctional Peace Officer Standards and Training Office, and we do not support any changes to the proposal that we put forward. We think it is a good, fair proposal that provides for a important dialogue between management and labor about how the prisons are managed.
I moved the Senate proposal.
Thank you. So we have a motion for the Senate proposal with that slight change, that the appointment would be made by the governor, not the legislature, with Senate confirmation. And the vote would be 2-1 on the Senate side, 3-0 on the Assembly side. Page 8, this was an Assembly proposal. Assemblywoman Weber?
We move the Assembly version. This is the, yes, Cal Grip program, yes.
All right. Okay. So the motion is for the Assembly version, 3-0?
3-0.
3-0.
We would just note that there is 9.2 million for this existing program. In totality, we're concerned about the ongoing state of the state's fiscal health by adding additional general funds such as this.
Thank you, Ms. Bosler. And for our listening public, this is our Cal Grip program, which is a California Gang Reduction, Intervention, and Prevention. The Assembly's proposal was to augment the program by $5 million out of the need for the program itself. Page 9, local public safety infrastructure.
This was,
So as we deal with page 9, I want to move forward to page 11 because we have a compromise that will incorporate the proposal of the Assembly for funding for 3 local public safety capital outlay projects in Avenal, Corcoran, and Lemoore. So I'm going to ask the LAO to walk us through the compromise for page 11, and then it will be clear as to what I'm talking about regarding page 9.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jessica Peters with the Analyst's Office. The compromise is a package of funding for local law enforcement assistance that addresses issues on both page 11 and page 9 of the agenda. The compromise would approve $20 million from the general fund for local law enforcement assistance with several different components. $7.85 million for local public safety infrastructure, which is the issue on page 9 of your agenda, for facilities in Kings County. $2 million to the Office of Emergency Services for nonprofit anti-terrorism grants, which was an issue that you took an action on last week. $150,000 for the Broadmoor Special Police District, and $10 million for BSCC to provide grants intended to strengthen the relationship between communities and law enforcement and associated budget bill language to implement that component.
Thank you, Ms. Peters. We're not going to revisit this whole debate, but I want to recap where we were when we last left this $40 million issue. I want to make really clear to everyone that's listening that the Senate and Assembly compromise here has to do with the disagreement that we've had with the Department of Finance. This is not in any way in anything but full support of the great work that our police chiefs and our police departments do throughout the state. The disagreement that we've had with Finance is that there was a 3-year agreement, as you walked us through last time, with a set amount for funding over a 3-year period, the last year of that 3-year period being the current budget year. Even through that 3-year period, we had Finance come back to us repeatedly to say needs and demands at the local level have increased. We have to increase the agreement we already agreed upon, and we, the conference committee, agreed to that in successive years. Here we are for a 4th year, and we don't want to be insensitive to the needs that are out there that Finance is representing in this request for $40 million, but at the same time, we can't have this committee completely disrespected that we're told it's once and final and last, and then it's brought to us yet again. So in a spirit of generosity and compromise and working together here, we're saying, okay, we can agree to half of that 40 for law enforcement purposes, but I will be very clear here that if there is yet another proposal in the January budget, when we get to this conference committee next year, should I be so fortunate to be sitting on it again, that we will have no doubt that it won't even be considered. This is the last of the last, as I said last year, for the last of the last, but again, trying to be agreeable here. So 20 million, out of that 20 million, as Ms. Peters has described, we would use 7.85 of it for the item on page 9. So that will take care of 3 local public safety capital outlay projects in the cities of Avenel, Corcoran, and Lemoore in Kings County. That there would be another 2 million. Right. This 2 million for the Office of Emergency Services for nonprofit anti-terrorism grants. I believe that's page 4 under the Office of Emergency Services. We'll get to that later, but that is where this comes from. And this was a proposal from the Assembly to deal with the fact that we've seen increased violence against many of our minority communities, specifically in the Jewish community, LGBT community, African American, Latino, Asian, disability, and that this 2 million would assist local law enforcement in anti-terrorism activities that they may have been funding out of their own pockets anyway. This $150,000 is for a very small request from Broadmoor in San Mateo County. They've been asking for twice this for the past 5 years. Finally, we can direct a small amount to them through this law enforcement assistance funding. And then lastly, 10 million, which was suggested from the Senate Budget Subcommittee, recognizing that in the era of Ferguson, there is a real need to address the challenges facing the relationship between our communities and law enforcement. We want to address it and direct some money toward it. And so that is where this package of 20 million comes from. So I think it's a compromise. It is standing our ground that we want the committee to be respected at the same time, thinking we're meeting you halfway. And that is how this compromise came to be.
Yes, and I would just note that every year in the fall, the governor puts together a budget. There are many decisions made based on what he views are the most important expenditures in that January 10 budget. Sometimes we continue one-time programs, sometimes we end them. This is something that is in the governor's discretion in building a budget.
Understood. And the remaining 20 million, we are not suggesting that there be any appropriation, that it will go back into the general fund for the use of all the other things that we're doing in the overall budget picture, but otherwise it's remained unspent. So that is the motion for the compromise. Of course, Senator Nielsen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must respectfully say I probably feel more strongly about this issue than any other one we're going to deal with in the budget. I put myself in the feet of local law enforcement. You know, the state of California has washed its hands of so many unrehabilitated and even unrehabilitated felons. Washed its hands, dumped it on the locals. We had a $40 million agreement. Now, was it for 3 years? Whatever. This legislature has shown no reluctance, including just a few minutes ago on the RFK Center, of, well, it'll be another year for that. You know, it's all a matter of priorities, what it's going to be another year for. I think this is one of the most important other year things that we need to pay a lot of attention to, because it directly relates to public safety and justice in our communities. Now, these 3 little communities that are kind of get caught up in this, sadly, and I'm well aware of the impact on them, and they need the help. I buy that. But I will not support a kind of proposal like this that continues the hypocrisy of the state of California dumping its problems on our local law enforcement, complicating justice within our communities for our citizens, and putting our public at risk. We can't do that anymore. And further, the worst part of this is tying the hands of local law enforcement and saying, well, this is what you've got to use it for. In terms of the terrorism portion, I see that as a priority, but not at the hands of tying the hands of local law enforcement. Let's come up with another pot of money for that particular purpose. This is a dangerous precedent, ladies and gentlemen. I am going to be a no vote.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen. Of course, respect our difference of opinion on this. And I just want to point out that it wasn't even 40 million when we first started talking about this 3 years ago. It started at 24 million, it grew to 29 million, it then grew to 40 million, and now another 40 million. With regard to the RFK healthcare issue, that is coming out of a special fund. It's a couple $1 million as opposed to $40 million. And so some differences there. And then I also just want to point out that this $40 million unexpected request for this fourth year of funding has to be put into some context. I'm happy to have LAO comment on this, but I have heard from a number of sources that if we add up all of the investment of local law enforcement, local taxes, county taxes, state taxes, taxpayers are spending about $10 billion on local law enforcement. And I see Mr. Soderberg nodding his head. So whether it's $9 billion or $10.1 billion, 40 million on top of 10 billion, which keeps coming back to us without any specifics, without any identification of how the money should be spent, without any reporting back requirements. It's a little confounding. Again, I didn't mean to revisit this whole conversation, but this is our proposal. The vote on the Senate side is 2-1, and
May I make a comment, Mr. Chairman, briefly?
Assemblywoman Melendez.
This is the type of compromise that I would ordinarily vote against, as I will today. This doesn't look anything like what we originally contemplating, and I do appreciate the work that went into it. And I know it probably pains you to have to go through all these iterations and, cut it in half. I know that's not easy, but this doesn't even come close to what we originally contemplated. And the $10 million, I just don't see how that helps the need right now. So I'm going to have to oppose this.
All right, so we have a 2-0, 2-0 on the compromise. 2-1, sorry, 2-1, 2-1 on the compromise. So just to revisit page 9 then, I'm not sure how that changes the vote, but then specifically for the funding for the 3 cities that we've already talked about, Avenel, Corcoran, and Lemoore, is it still 2-1 or you want to go to 3-0, your choice?
I would support the small city.
Okay, so we have 3-0 and
I didn't realize we were separating the vote. I'm sorry. I will be an aye on that.
okay, that's fair enough. 3-0, 3-0. And then moving on to page 10.
Move the Senate version. Move the Senate version.
All right, the Senate version declined to hear the proposed trailer bill language that allowed a probationer who's absconded to be charged with a probation violation after the term of probation would have ended. That's 2-1 on the Senate side and 2-1 on the Assembly side. So colleagues, we've completed public safety with the exception at Assemblywoman Melendez's request to hold open the closure of the rehabilitation center. Are you ready at this point, or?
Well, I don't know. Is Assemblywoman Weber ready?